Today's video will be a standalone build-only look at the Warlord games in Italy Jagdpanzer 38T Hetzer. I say this as I usually follow up my build videos with a painting videos the following week, but I have a separate plan for painting not just this but my entire German motor pool, as it's getting out of hand. This 1:56 scale Hetzer kit was a prize for my local tournament, which is nice. Included in the box is the usual bolt action related accessories, the fluffy wool smoke markers, thank you Cosmina for packing this up, there's a transfer sheet, and we'll see when I get round to painting that what transfers I end up using. There are two stat cards. One has the main anti-tank gun and flamethrower variant of the Hetzer, and the other is for the anti-air variant. And of course, there are the instructions which I'll show on screen in case anyone at home has lost theirs and needs it as reference. I noticed immediately, even just looking through the instructions, that the suspension and tracks are not the usual style for artillery, and we'll look at that in a moment. I will also mention as we go through there are a couple of points where the images in the instructions aren't entirely helpful, although nothing's really that bad. And of course the last part of the kit, and the most important part of the kit, is the plastic sprues that contain the model itself. One part here did get knocked off of the sprue, but it got caught in the bag and wasn't damaged, thankfully. These sprues are really nicely moulded, oddly separated, as if this was an older style of sprue rather than the other artillery kits that I've made. I also noticed as I built the kit that there's a lot of extra tabs hanging off of some of the parts, and these are usually to ensure that plastic flows all of the way through the part and any voids or air bubbles end up in the tabs rather than in the parts of the model. And these are really easy to clean up. It's no different than any sprue gate on the other side of the model parts, and so there's no real trouble here. Well, let's get a building. With the suspension, as normal, is the first part of the kit, but in this specific kit the suspension has a few separate pieces. We have a leaf spring suspension piece that the road wheels glue onto, and the road wheels are keyed rather than free rotating. And there are 4 sets of this to build. These side plates behind the suspension then gets a few smaller pieces before you want to put the suspension pieces on. There's a little cover piece for the back, and this is one of those parts that I wasn't entirely sure how it was supposed to go on. The instructions don't really show a good image of it. It could be recessed or it could be sitting proud. Again, I wasn't sure. I glued them in place as best I could. There are 2 pieces for the idler wheel, both keyed so they can only go in one way round, and there's further keying on the inside of the idler wheel for the tracks, and we'll put those on in a few moments. For the middle there is a single return roller, which is properly keyed and fits nicely. The drive sprocket at the front ends up with 4 pieces all stacked on top of each other, and each of them has keying so everything should line up really nicely. And of course the drive sprocket itself has keying on the inside for the tracks, as we mentioned. I did notice while building all of this that it was slightly odd and all at a weird angle, and that's because the hull side is angled, and so everything should be sticking out at an angle to make sure it's straight when the model is complete. But with those smaller pieces on, I can put on the main suspension sets, and you'll see here they go underneath the top piece of both the drive sprocket and return roller, so if you're sensible you'll put those on after, but really I didn't find this any type of trouble whatsoever. To fit the tracks on, I'll actually recommend that you do this differently from how I'm showing on screen, as I only recorded my first side. The way I did it on the second side, which worked much better, was to position the smallest pieces first, using the keying on the drive sprocket and the idler wheel. After that, place the longer top and bottom pieces in place, and they fit much more easily. But regardless of which method you use, you will have to dab glue on the road wheels and idler and carefully hold the entire track assembly together in alignment while the glue sets. There is keying at the end of each of the pieces of track, but honestly they don't seem to fit, and you'll either have to bend them inwards or, like I did, cut them off entirely. Eventually, with some fiddling and holding everything in place while the glue dries, the tracks can be made to look pretty good. And we'll immediately stick both of the sides of the track assembly now to the hull's base. Again, usually with Italeri kits, the whole suspension assembly is built in a way that allows them to be separate for painting, and I do like to do that, but in this case you really do have to assemble all of the lower hull and tracks in one block for painting, although you can keep the top of the hull separate, and we'll show that later on if you want to, although I didn't. The rear piece is separate to ensure the detail is moulded correctly, and all of this fits together securely on its keying ledges. There are some shelf things on the back of the hull that I'll go on in a moment. These have some stowage, and I decided to put the stowage on first as I thought that would be easier. There is a jack on the right piece and some form of stowage box for the left. After that I put those in place on the lower hull. Now here's a point that hit me with some instructions that stumped me. There are these two little doodads that are supposed to go on the rear of the hull, and I couldn't figure out exactly where. There's no pictures from the rear of the finished model or in the instructions, and when I looked up real examples of the vehicle I couldn't find anything that matched. And so I left them off. Well, I moved on to the hull top now and put a whole bunch of little things on it. The upper hull is the same between the anti-tank and flamethrower armed variants of the Hetzer, and I'll mention that again in a moment. There is a totally tiny little aiming periscope that goes in this little pinhole. However, the cover piece doesn't go over the top very easily, so I highly recommend that you put the cover piece on first and perhaps use tweezers to put the periscope in. Please learn from my mistakes. There is a hatch just behind it which has different pieces if you want it open or closed. Strangely I went with closed even though there is a commander figure for this model. On the other side, a smaller hatch also has opened and closed versions, and I went with open because there's an optional rangefinder periscope, and that just looks cool. The periscope does have to be glued in from the inside, which is slightly fiddly, but really not that hard. I noticed that the hatch has a circle on it, which feels to me like it's a plastic injection point rather than a model kit detail, but I wasn't necessarily sure, so I did actually leave it in the end. There is an arm for the jack that goes on the right hand side of the hull, a little cover for the headlight that looks like a little helmet, and some kind of box thing that goes on the front, and you're supposed to drill holes for this, but I was too lazy to find my drill, so I just cut the pegs off and eyeballed the position. For the top we have an MG34 and a shield for it. This is controlled remotely from inside the hull, but unfortunately it doesn't have an easy way to make it movable. Now I could kit bash something up, a little peg on the inside, but I just decided to glue it pointing across the hull, as that would protect it from damage when moving the model. I was about to put the exhaust on here, but it actually fits over the gap between the upper and lower hull, so I'll leave that for a little bit until I put the upper and lower hull together. We can now make the main guns for the two main variants, starting with the anti-tank gun, and that's probably the variant that I'm going to be using the most. There is a trunnion that glues onto the gun's mount, and a second piece of it which holds the gun itself. Without gluing it in place directly, you can leave the gun to elevate and depress. This doesn't have a whole lot of surface for glue to hold the trunnion together, however, so being careful to not glue the gun is required, or you could just glue it all together and have the gun be fixed. That would be fine as well. And the last piece here is a gun shield that goes all the way over the gun to hide the hole in the hull that the gun pokes through, and there's just a tiny little keying peg for that to glue onto to hold it aligned. For the flamethrower variant, this is easier. The gun's casement just has a little plate that slides into it, and the barrel, hose, tube, flamethrower, sticky out bit glues onto the front of that. Now I noticed there was a gap, and the shape of the parts mean that this gap is intentional, but I couldn't find if this was correct. I struggled to find a picture of a real tank from directly 90 degrees that show the gap, but a lot of the pictures do show that there might be a gap there, but I just can't confirm one way or another. And the last piece for the flamethrower variant is a little vent thing that goes on the top. Now I didn't record this section, but to make it a little bit modular, I drilled into a scrap piece of Warlord's trapezoid profile sprue and glued a magnet into it, and then glued that into the hull so that it stuck out into the gun's mantlets. Then I put a piece of metal washer onto each of the weapons that would stick to the magnet, and I finally have magnetized the tank now. Are you happy, internet? Are you? Of course not. But I was happy with my modular weapon, and I could seal up the hull. I put poly cement all of the way around the join between the upper and lower hull to get the strongest join. I wiggled the pieces to mix the melting plastic together, and to ensure it was aligned, I pushed the upper hull backwards against this ledge at the back, and then pressed the front of the hull together as well, holding it all for a few minutes just to be sure, and afterwards it is a solid block. You might notice that there are some side skirts on the Hetzer, and I've not included those, but there are some examples of Hetzers that do not have the side skirts, and I thought it looked more interesting without them. The last detail for this little tank hunter is the exhaust. There are two versions, and I went with the earlier versions as I went with the earlier idler wheel at the beginning, and that is my little Hetzer complete with swappable weapons between anti-tank and flamethrower versions. But there are parts for another variant, and so I took a look at the anti-air autocannon, and to start that off I glued the rotation wheels to it, which are nicely keyed with two little tags to ensure that they are pretty secure. Now I recommend waiting for these to set fully before continuing, as you probably want to put a little bit of pressure on it in the next few steps, and you don't want these to collapse. When that is dry, take the two halves of the mount and glue them to the base, sandwiching the gun's wheels in without glue. This can be fiddly to hold all of these pieces in place while it sets, so just relax, hold it lightly, and to hold it for as long as it needs. There is a oddly very small seat that goes in the side, and a foot pedal trigger that goes in front of that. Both are pretty small, so can be quite fiddly, and whilst those set we can build the frame, which is really easily just two sets of legs which each attach to the flat plate mounting piece. The gun then attaches to the mount with a round peg, and if you make sure you don't glue that, you can even rotate the gun. You can, if you like, glue this and the other fancy internals into the lower hull and use the second alternate upper hull that's cut out to fit the autocannon. I, however, have already glued my hull together, and so these will all go into the bits box. Instead of that, I put the gun onto a 25mm base so that I can use it as a piece of portable terrain. And I might use it as an air defense on a rooftop, that sort of thing, or as an auto defense autocannon for some science fiction game. But we came here for the Jagdpanzer, the Tank Hunter 38T Hetzer, which is now built. I did mention I'll be painting it, but not in next week's video, so be patient for that. I will get around to painting my German vehicles eventually. I really quite enjoyed building this kit. The suspension looks much nicer than some of Italiary's offerings, without being a whole rigmarole of building a zillion tiny parts, although getting it to line up was a bit of a struggle. The keying for the vast majority of the kit makes the model a really solid little block, and so it will stand up quite nicely to the rigorous gaming, moving around on terrain and having dice rolled at it-ness that happens to all wargaming vehicles. Let me know what you think of this kit in the comment section below, and I'll leave you with, I'm sure, what you've all wanted me to say, which is what a Hetzer gonna do, which is, of course, hunt tanks, because that's what Jagdpanzer translates to. I'm ED-SKaR, or always will be, and thank you very much for watching.